provider of the flipping out. Okay, I'm gonna sit here. Just come in there.
Welcome everyone, good afternoon. I'm Kate Watson, Atlantic Publicist at Nimbus Publishing, and I'd like to welcome you this afternoon to the launch of Painted Worlds, The Art of Maud Lewis, A Critical Perspective. We acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This land is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship. We recognize that we are all treaty people and have responsibilities to each other and this land. We also recognize the 400-plus year history of communities of African descent and the 50 African Nova Scotia communities throughout the region today. We are grateful to work at Mi'kma'ki. We are continually learning more about how we can deeply engage and move forward the work of truth, reconciliation, and equity. We recognize that without action, an acknowledgement is empty. It marks the beginning of the work ahead of us, not the end. I want to thank everyone who had a hand in bringing this incredible book together, including the book's amazing editor, Emily McKinnon, and Nimbus's managing editor, Whitney Moran. Also, thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts and the province of Nova Scotia, whose support makes our publishing program possible. And of course, a thank you to the author of Painted Worlds, Dr. Laurie Dalton, for shedding a new light on the amazing art of Maud Lewis. As you may already know, Dr. Laurie Dalton is the director, curator of the Acadia University Art Gallery and an adjunct professor in the Department of History and Classics. Her research interests lie in Canadian visual culture and museum and exhibition history. In particular, how meaning is a process of display, didactics, and audience exchange. And now I'll turn the mic over to Laurie.
Great, thank you.
So welcome everyone today. I'm not going to say too many thank yous because they're mostly in the book, but a really big thank you to Nimbus for all their focused kind of dedication in this very long process, not just of editing, but also of making sure we got the design just right and the colors and all of those other elements. And thank you all for coming on a beautiful Saturday, since it has been a long, treacherous winter. So the plan for today is I'm going to do a bit of an illustrated talk highlighting some of the points in the book, but not giving everything away, to encourage you to get the book. And then we'll have some time for questions also at the end. Or we look at a dark screen. Yay. So I want to start first by talking about the journey, essentially, that got me to kind of writing this book, because I think it talks a lot about how, there's never a race in which to complete a project. So I've been thinking about Maud Lewis since I did my master's thesis, and that was back in 2003. I then came and took a position at Acadia University, and then I did an exhibition in 2018 on the work of Maud Lewis. And that exhibition in 2018 asked two big questions. One, the relationship that collectors had to Maud Lewis works, because often there's an intimate kind of connection that people have to her artworks. The second element was kind of a frustration that I often found when people were talking about Maud Lewis, was not really focusing on the artworks themselves, particularly around the language of modern art. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that. So this didn't happen at all. So we're going to go to this image here. Should I keep my thumb on this the whole time? So this is an installation view from 2018 called Maud Lewis, A Life Collected. And so some of the kind of discoveries that came out of that exhibition made their way into this book. So that exhibition included several works of art that hadn't been seen publicly before, and really got me thinking much more about the language that we use around modern art, and why some artists essentially fall into the canon, and why other artists continually kind of exist kind of outside or on the periphery. So that's kind of one of the key goals, let's say, of this book. So I'm going to kind of walk you through some of the ideas of the book, but as I said, there'll be some time for questions at the end as well. So the image that I put up here, it's an image of Maud Lewis at work from CBC Telescope in the 1960s, and then the image below is an image of a poorhouse or an almshouse that was located not far from where Maud Lewis lived. So Maud Lewis lived from 1901, some say 1903, so it depends on who you ask on what day, but 1901 until 1970. And she lived essentially between the Yarmouth-Digby corridor, but really settled in an area called Marshalltown, and that's the area that she became quite well known and quite famous for, because she painted her house. The interior was all filled with kind of a collection and bric-a-brac, which we'll kind of talk about today, but she painted the outside of her house, and that also became her studio where she sold artwork. So by the 1960s, though, there started to be a lot of interest in Maud Lewis's work. So coverage in things like the Star Weekly, but arguably, to me, one of the most important sources is the CBC Telescope from the 1960s, because it's one of the few sources in which Maud Lewis is actually speaking for herself. So for Maud Lewis fans, what you'll often encounter in the story of Maud Lewis is that it's often others speaking on her behalf. So it's people sharing memories of her or interpretations of her. And so the Telescope series is interesting because she's actually talking in her own words. Although typical for the 1960s, like through a gendered lens, Everett is given much more airtime and is actually interviewed much more than she is, even though she was the artist and the reason for their visit. So I put up this quote here, and it kind of talks about how early kind of storytelling, right? And so early narratives, I'm talking about press, I'm talking about films, tended to set up this kind of bucolic tale of Maud Lewis as a happy-go-lucky folk native painting in her painted house. And it removed a lot of the other associations and lived realities that Maud Lewis had, such as a life of poverty, such as, you know, a very real experience, say, of the almshouse, right, which would be located not far. So one of the chapters in the book is called Stories We Tell, and it talks about the systems of kind of narrations and stories around her. Perhaps the most recognizable story for many that might have been an introduction for some people to Maud Lewis is this film called Maudie. So when I did the exhibition in 2018, I purposely had refused to watch the film. So for a long time, I did not want to watch the film because I didn't want to kind of cloud my approach to the exhibition and my approach to some of the research I was doing. I do talk quite a lot about this film in the book, so I have watched the film. And one of the things that I talk about, or I make an argument for in the book, is what I call the Maudie effect. So one of the things that the book is trying to do is bridge the gap between, you know, an art historical kind of museum studies approach with a really applicable, accessible kind of language in terms of how the arguments are presented. So the Maudie effect is essentially borrowing on a museum term called the Bilbao effect. So the image that I put on the screen in the lower corner is referring to the Guggenheim, which was built in Bilbao, Spain. And the Guggenheim was built in Bilbao, Spain, in an area that was kind of like neglected. So it was kind of an industrial area that wasn't kind of occupied. So there was a whole series of kind of agreements between kind of governments, local organizations, the architect Frank Gehry, and Guggenheim Foundation to create this kind of purpose-built museum called the Guggenheim Bilbao. And what happened when this museum was built, it kind of created a domino effect. And it essentially showed that arts and culture drive the economy, right? So often we can think, the argument tends to be that arts and culture kind of, you know, take from the economy. This really proves that they actually infuse the economy. So when the Guggenheim Bilbao was built, it essentially created a domino effect of condos being built, restaurants, businesses, people started to move to the area, tourism in the area increased. So there was a massive economic kind of result of that. So I was talking about the importance of cultural to kind of infuse things. So I was thinking about the film Maudie, and after the film Maudie, it kind of led to a whole regrowth and re-interest in Maud Lewis's work, particularly international interest in her work, which led to a whole series of things. So anyone that's following the news a tiny bit will see that her works just keep climbing and climbing and climbing in price. Or there's been the recent thefts, right, that have happened further down the province. She's now in an exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, which perhaps might have never kind of happened before. There's now another touring exhibition. So I kind of talk about how the Mahdi effect helped to increase and infuse interest in her work again, and infuse, let's say, some of the mania perhaps around her work as well. So for many people, the thing that kind of cements an idea of who Maud Lewis is as an artist is her painted house and the house in which she lived. So there's a chapter in the book called The Domestic Interior, and it talks about her house. It talks about her house, it's actually like it's a lived space, right? So this was her home. It was also her studio, so it's where she created her artwork, but it's also where she sold her artwork. So the chapter kind of unpacks all those different ways of trying to kind of understand the painted house. The painted house is also a site of a murder, because after Maud Lewis dies, Everett is actually killed on the premises, right? Killed in that area. And that's often not talked about because that doesn't really help with a happy-go-lucky image, right, of the house. But it talks about all these kind of versions of ways to kind of understand the house. But also I talk about in the book about how it also situates a very particular kind of domestic view of Maud Lewis. Often when we're talking about Maud Lewis, we often refer to her by her first name, Maud or Maudie or Armaud. We don't often do that with, for example, a lot of male artists. So the book kind of explores that the way we've kind of talked about her house helps to kind of create a certain level of like familiarity that we feel we have with Maud Lewis, which then kind of feeds into the ability to say market her work. My thumb's not moving. So this is an image here of the house. Here we go. So this is an image of the house as installed, right? So the house, many people would interpret and understand the house as installed at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. That's where it's effectively been on permanent display since the late 1990s. And we're going to look at some interior images of the house. So this is the stove. And I talk in the book about the importance of kind of the stove in the house. The stove was essentially, a key kind of object for their existence, right? The source of heat, the source of food, but it also became an object in which she overlaid and painted and kind of worked on. The other images here are showing part of her studio in the lower corner, as well as there's stairs kind of going up here and a kind of sleeping in a table area here. So anyone that's seen the house will observe right away about how it's filled with so many things. So one of the approaches for the book was to actually really look really closely at the house, at what actually is included in the house. What types of collected objects, what types of calendars, what types of containers. And I kind of make an argument that a lot of that finds its way through Maud Lewis's paintings, and so we'll see that today. So one of the things when people often talk about or have talked about Maud Lewis is there tends to be a general kind of description of not just like a happy-go-lucky, naive folk painter, but one that effectively just painted for a tourist market and kept just repeating images again and again and again. And I think, for me, it's been a little bit problematic because, and we'll see today, there's lots of artists that have worked in repetition, and we have celebrated repetition in other artists, but we've often used that as a way to detract from Maud Lewis's skill. We've also often used the fact that she was effectively working within an economic market, right, contributing to the tourist economy in Nova Scotia in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and saying, well, she was making artwork to sell, right? So then she's just like not a true artist. And so that kind of feeds into this idea that what a true artist has to like be destitute, and that doesn't, to me, make sense either. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is also really situating artists and cultural workers as contributors like to the economy, right? Maud Lewis was contributing to the economy by creating works. They also were a way in which she lived. And so one of the things is talking about the separation between an art and an artifact and commodity, and how her works have kind of shifted like across those at different kind of points of time and different decades. So one example of that, of this kind of artifact kind of commodity question is 3 black cats. And I originally was not going to include 3 black cats at all in the book, and I included very little of 3 black cats in the exhibition at Acadia. Because I would argue that I don't think 3 Black Cats is Maud Lewis's best work. I argue that it's her most recognizable work. And there's many reasons for that, right? And so 3 Black Cats was kind of featured in CBC Telescope. So there's a key moment where a woman comes into the painted house, buys the artwork. But black cats, in terms of advertising culture, are also super cute, right? So who doesn't like a little tiny kitten? Maud Lewis also painted little fluffy kind of white cats. So they fit into kind of a cute idea, right, of a folk artist. There are also images of Maud Lewis that got repeated again and again and again, right? So the more times that you repeat an image by an artist, then the more that kind of solidifies that idea for the artist. So you can find Maud Lewis happy black cats on aprons, on socks, you know, on tea cozies. You can pretty much find a happy cat on any kind of object related to Maud Lewis. I'm just going to show this image here. This is just a detail of one of the paintings in the book. This is a painting from Bear River. And what's interesting about this painting is its size. So many things are interesting, but the size is quite interesting because Maud Lewis tended to work in a very particular kind of size and dimension because those are the materials that she had access to. There's also another pragmatic reason, is that if you're also targeting and you're selling to tourists, the size also kind of matters, right? You're not going to like tie a gigantic painting on the top of your car. But there were a lot of people that summered, right, in that area around Digby and Yarmouth corridor. So she would receive commissions for works. Commissions to paint things like bread tins or things like shutters. In this case, this was a commission for a larger painting. One of the things, though, that I wanted to kind of look at in the book, and the book does quite extensively, is try and match her approach to artwork with archival material from the period. To make the argument that Maud Lewis, in fact, was an astute observer of her surroundings, not just randomly painting her surroundings. And so one of the kind of early descriptions of Maud Lewis was, well, she never traveled more than 60 miles. You know, isn't it just cute and joyful that she painted? And I find that a very narrow view of her work. So by drawing on the archival material, so there's photographs included in the book, other archival material, it situates the kind of the environment in which she was painting and talking about how she's inspired by the landscape, but she's distilling the landscape into her own language, which is a key thing that we celebrate in modern artists, right? In the history of modern art, that's typically something we always celebrate, that a modern artist shows the essence of a place. And so this book kind of talks about some of those strategies as well. So I talk about how she's capturing often the mood or the feeling of an environment. So we're gonna go back to this next image here. I think we're still okay for portrait. So I quite like this image because it's a titled work. One of the, let's say, challenges for Maud Lewis works is Maud Lewis did not title her work. She didn't frame her work, right? They were essentially painted, sold fairly immediately to collectors and tourists. It has been institutions and it has been collectors that have given titles to her work. And typically, very straightforward titles like Pair of Deer, Winter Sleigh Ride. So we're not talking the most imaginative titles, but those have all been added after the fact. So in this painting, she's actually titled the work, and this is also an early work from the 1940s. So this is maritime fishing boats. But what it also shows, and one of the things that the book talks about, is Maud Lewis's use of color. So often there's a discussion of, well, she just used any material she could get a hold of, she didn't mix colors, things were painted hastily, she just painted for tourists. So the book is not trying to be an exhaustive overview of all of Maud Lewis's artwork. Rather, what it does is it chooses a few works of art to show how she's exploring color. And what I mean by that is the way that she puts, complementary colors next to each other, or secondary colors next to each other. the way that she lays out and organizes her paintings actually creates the paintings in a lively, energetic way. So it's not accidental that she's doing that. So there's several chapters in the book. So the last two chapters of the book talk about materials of inspiration and her approach to seriality, so her repetition of images. So there's a few kind of, for me, because I don't know, I love Maud Lewis, so hopefully for others, because you're here, exciting finds in the book that I want to talk about really briefly right now. So one of the kind of approaches was to try and really situate Maud Lewis not just in, the photography and other images of, what was happening in Nova Scotia in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, but the actual kind of zeitgeist of that period, the cultural kind of mood of that period. So it's long been speculated that Maud Lewis has drawn direct kind of inspiration from advertising culture, but there are very few exact examples. So the most well-known is a McLean's ad, which is discussed in the book, but I found some other ones that are kind of included in the book for the first time. So to me, that was really exciting. But that's only possible from a really slow, painstaking, laborious process. So I really want to thank organizations like Nova Scotia Archives or Nova Muse who have digitized their collections because it's really allowed this project to continue like during COVID. But I could basically just sit and spend far too many weeks and hours going through like a decade by decade of, say, the Eaton's catalog, trying to kind of find matches. So it was a bit of a needle in a haystack process. So one of the images that I found is this one that we have here, which is a detail from an Eaton's catalog. So Eaton's catalogs, particularly like the mail order Eaton's catalogs, were a really important part of experience in rural Nova Scotia, right? Or others can think of like the Sears Dream Book or any of those types of catalogs, right? They were mailed all over, so you could be in a remote part of Nova Scotia, but have essentially access, right, to all the images and the goods and products that were existing in that period. So this page is, I think, very exciting and interesting because there's correlations between this page and things that you find in Maud Lewis's house. So the grandfather clock, for example, this grouping of bluebirds, or this grouping of deer in the bottom. So to me, this kind of example helps to betray the assumption that Maud Lewis was unskilled and that she was not trained. Instead, what I'm trying to argue is that she was essentially observing, right, all of not only the surroundings in which she was living in, but taking inspiration from all the material, particularly the advertising material that surrounded her, and borrowing from it and kind of mashing it and putting it in new ways. So I'm going to show two other examples that what I'm talking about of this kind of cultural kind of energy of the period, which is a film, Bambi. So Bambi's Disney movie comes out in 1942, and Bambi is distributed widely across North America and is a massive success. Essentially, if you're hanging out in the 1940s, you saw Bambi, right? So everyone would have seen this film. If not, they would have been talking about this film. So the central story, right, Bambi kind of starts off tragic, then cute, and then they always market it as a love story, which I always find fascinating because I find Bambi quite sad. But the early marketing in the 1940s always marketed the story of Bambi as like a lovely love story. So I'm trying to imagine people going to the theater and then seeing how the movie starts. But one of the things that Maud Lewis did is repeat her images. And so one of the things that I kind of talk about is if Maud Lewis is, painting and living in a period of all of these types, and Maud Lewis was a really big fan of the movies, right, and music and all those things. So she's existing kind of within that period. So I'm not saying for sure that her pair of deer are absolutely inspired by Bambi, but I think it's quite likely that it's inspired by Bambi. And if we're also talking about how she's creating works for a tourist market, this type of imagery, right, of a deer and a fawn would have been really kind of interesting for collectors at the time, this type of cute kind of folklore image of the landscape. So I'm going to show one more example in terms of a direct kind of ad. So there's several versions of this painting, and it's a painting of the Eerie Train. So the Eerie Train did not operate in the area in which Maud Lewis lived. So why did she paint the Eerie Train? Where did she perhaps get information and ideas about this train? So this particular series of paintings were driving me crazy because I could not find the example. I had been looking for it forever. So in 2018, several of these paintings were on that exhibition in the gallery, and I was doing all these public talks, and I kept just going like, someone in the universe, maybe there is like a trained expert that will help with this process. So as a result of that exhibition in 2018, a train fan found the exact advertisement, which is what we have here. So there was an advertisement that was celebrating the launch of the Eerie Train and the different, basically businessmen involved in the launch of the train. So it was this image that we see here. And so she revisited images of the Eerie Train again and again and again, but she adjusted them each time. So sometimes there would be people, sometimes not. Sometimes Eerie's listed, sometimes not. So it's a good example of her taking a direct kind of inspiration from advertising material, but still kind of editing it and modifying it. So it's not a kind of direct copy. But you can see this detailing here. So there's figures on the tree, obviously it says Eerie, and there's very different formations in her versions of how many people she includes in the back of the train. But for me, this was a really exciting discovery, as well as the Eaton's catalog, because it shows how much more there is to kind of still kind of discover in her work, and helping to kind of help that argument move forward in a much stronger way. So the last thing that I want to talk about is her use of repetition, or her use of surreality. Well, one of the things that I talk about in the book is, in a way, I kind of call to tasks, curators like myself, but also collectors and institutions that have set up a way of talking about Maud Lewis, but also have set up a way of talking about folk art, where typically folk art is kept on the periphery. Often you don't have folk art included, say in fine art exhibitions. It's often in an ethnographic museum or a history museum. So one of the things the book kind of is talking about in a larger scale is, as we have museums, right, are called to task to start to kind of reimagine their own histories and their own collections, which should absolutely happen. It gives room to have a more nuanced conversation around artists that perhaps we haven't kind of talked about in the same way before. So the book talks about how language is power, right? And so we have artists like here, we have Claude Monet or Andy Warhol, that most people would know those artists' names. These are artists that have been exhibited again and again. They have been written about again and again. They have kind of been, codified, right, as key kind of artists. And so the book talks about the language we use for some artists is often sometimes forgotten, right, for other artists. So Monet and Warhol, I'm kind of interested in how they would actually feel if they were alive next to each other in this image, but that's a different talk. If Warhol and Monet were in a room together, what would they talk about? But they were both celebrated for their repetition, right, of imagery. Monet was really interested in a repetition of imagery because he was interested in the way that light and times of day would change landscape. And in this particular series, he's looking at the shifts of haystacks or grain stacks at various times of day. He did many, many versions of this painting and was really celebrated for looking at that kind of variations in his approach. Warhol did repetition almost through a kind of pop culture or a mechanical kind of approach to repetition. So one of the things that the book starts with is it says to have seen one Maud Lewis painting is to not to have seen them all. So typically people see a Maud Lewis painting and they go, oh, like it's so joyful. But she painted many paintings, which are worth study, but even though she repeated her images, there's lots of variances in them. There was a really interesting study, for example, around Warhol's work. And people talk about, because Warhol, worked in a factory and was very much about a mechanical approach to his artwork. But even Warhol's silk screens have variations in the application of kind of color and pigment or in the overlay of image. So I kind of use that in thinking about Maud Lewis's work, is that it's really about variances. So it's not just looking about one oxen. What happens when you look at a bunch of oxen all together? And the slight adjustments and variances that she puts in them. And usually she'll often use a lot of decorative elements, like floral elements like tulips and things like that. And you'll see those repeat again and again in her works. So I'm going to end with this last image because this is how the book ends. And this is what I call in the book kind of a composite image or a choose your own adventure image. So if we think about repeated images that Maud Lewis visited, this is kind of one where it's like all together. It's like you want a happy maritime scene, it's here. Winter scene, it's here. Boat in water, it's here. Birds in sky, here. Oxen, here. So I kind of call these like this composite image. And I think of these as like a strategic artwork, right? Like if you're a tourist and you're trying to collect a painting, this, might cover off a lot of your boxes if you can't choose. Should you get oxen, should you get winter? You have them all kind of in this one. But there's many versions of these types of composite images as well. So Nimbus had asked me to read a little small section of the book, so I'm going to read a very small element of the afterword of the book, and then we'll have some time for questions. And I'm actually going to end with this image here, which is an image of, some might recognize her, some might not. This is Amy Sedaris. And there is Maud Lewis painting in this image. So I just kind of want to talk about that. I want to start first with the afterword. So the afterword starts with a quote, and so I kind of want to read that out for everyone today. And it's from the Digby Courier, August 8th, 1970. So it's Maud Lewis has died. In the passing of Maud Lewis, Digby's primitive and widely acclaimed artist, there has been removed from our midst one of the most unique combinations of humility and greatness. But the memory of this wisp of a woman will without a doubt linger long and will continue to supply writer's copy and artist's conversation. So the afterword starts. It can be easy to dismiss the artwork of Maud Lewis as a byproduct of the tourist market or minimize it as repetitive and derivative. But it's important for us to question who draws those lines of value. The fact that Lewis created works for the tourist market does not negate or diminish their role as artworks. The idea that art exists outside of economic exchanges is not the reality of artists. They must make a living. Artists, while creating works, are part of economic development. Indeed, the paintings of Maud Lewis can tell us much about the exchange economy of 20th century Nova Scotia. Our framing ought to consider not only why she painted rural pastoral images, but also why she chose those images in particular. The depictions of rolling hills, of apple blossoms, of harbors, they suited the collectors and markets for whom she was painting and drew on the landscapes in which she's most familiar. I just want to skip ahead. We're going to read the Sedaris part. What I have termed the Maudie effect is the growth and proliferation of Maud Lewis in pop culture. Intense interest in her life, painted house, and art, which only continues to increase through exhibitions both in Canada and internationally. In tandem, sales of her work through dealers and at auction continue to break records, selling for tens of thousands of dollars. While the province has used Lewis as a marketable commodity, her life and art have inspired the work of other musicians, writers, and artists in more nuanced and complex ways. Perhaps, though, most telling is Lewis's work as inspiration in the phantasmagoria of pop culture and media today in the set design of Amy Sedaris' series At Home with Amy. So it ran from 2017 to 2020. This series takes a zany and comedic approach to the crafting and entertaining genre and has a 1950s aesthetic. Sedaris is a Maud Lewis collector in real life, and her home is a veritable cabinet of curiosity, of collected art and bric-a-brac. This inspired the set of the series. As Sedaris notes, "I get that, but it's not campy. It looks like the inside of my apartment, but prettier and bigger. I wanted to celebrate artists that never get celebrated. The crafts are inspired by Maud Lewis, a Canadian folk artist. What we see here is that Maud Lewis now has entered not just the lexicon of collectors, museums, and directly inspired other artists, and we have one here today. Hi, Laura. But her aesthetics and design elements now form part of the styling of pop culture media. It will be interesting to see what iteration we see next in the mythos of Maud Lewis. So I just want to finish with the last closing element of the book. Lewis's paintings extend far beyond their trope of happy little pictures to tell us much about the conditions and time period in which they were painted. But importantly, they also tell us about the time period in which they exist today, becoming a vestige in which systems of value are laid bare. So thank you very much. So I think we have a couple minutes for questions. Is that, yes? Yeah, so does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Yeah. Thanks, Lori. You mentioned she's largely been spoken for by other people. How did she represent herself when she spoke about herself?
So the main source that we have for her speaking about herself is the CBC Telescope coverage in the 1960s. And so the CBC Telescope was a series, back in the day where they were highlighting kind of key Canadians. And it was a series that was seen across kind of Canada. It was also, a culture at the time where everyone had a TV and everyone kind of gathered around and watched the TV. So it had a huge kind of viewership. So Telescope series kind of followed a certain kind of narrative pattern, right, where you'd go and you'd visit someone and you'd ask kind of questions. So most of what we have her speaking about her work really comes from that. And she's fairly quiet and soft-spoken in that. But maybe there's a secret Maud Lewis diary somewhere. Any other questions? Yes?
Just to add to that, I mean, that documentary sort of helps to build that image of Maud Lewis as you're presenting without looking at that. It does not look at the harsh realities that we all learned about since then. So it sort of was the base, I think, of that image of the happy-go-lucky, very self-facing, just happy to paint and all that.
Well, and what's interesting about that series, so one of the things I do in the book is I kind of situate the films of Maud Lewis and other films happening in Canada in the period. So, there's a well-known Maud Lewis film comes out in, can't remember, late 1970s, but it's also around the same time that there's another film that comes out called Going Down the Road, which is a celebrated Canadian film. Going Down the Road really talks about an exodus, right, that was happening from Nova Scotia, right? It follows two kind of young men. They leave Nova Scotia on a road trip to go and kind of seek fortune, right, in Toronto, and then obviously their hopes and dreams are kind of dashed. But Going Down the Road focuses a lot on the scenes of looking at a very dilapidated, kind of run down rural Nova Scotia that you have to run from and leave. Whereas CBC Telescope in the 1960s, and then other films of kind of Maud Lewis in the 1970s, celebrate rural Nova Scotia as an idyllic pastoral paradise. So you have these kind of dichotomies that even happen in the way the films are kind of being narrated. But if you want to situate Maud Lewis as a happy-go-lucky folk, then you're kind of going to picture her house in a particular way. Of course, you're going to avoid those other elements, and so I find that that contrast quite interesting at the time. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
The slide that you had of the stove polish with the black hat.
Yes.
Do you think Maud Lewis was inspired by that advertising, as you have alluded to in your other slides, or vice versa?
I think so. The black hat shoe polish, the black hat stove polish was heavily kind of circulated. So I can't say for sure that it would have been in the home, but there is so much packaging and things in the home that you can kind of only tell through photographs, right? So CBC Telescope, there was a Star Weekly piece in the 1960s where photographer Bob Brooks documented. And so that's really been invaluable because you can literally try and kind of zoom in and see some of those items. But there's other images, not of Maud Lewis's house, but of other rural Nova Scotians living in the period. So photographer John Collier, for example, did a big tour around like Yarmouth and Digby and kind of documented like interiors of homes in the period. And so some of his photographs are in the book. So part of it was trying to kind of find that correlation. To me, the imagery of the black cat face and the stove polish is so similar.
Mm-hmm.
Like just the shape of the head, the circular of the eyes, like it's hard for me to think that's just like completely accidental and that she wouldn't have seen it somewhere and then maybe reworked it. But that I can't say for sure. Any other comments or questions? Yes?
Thanks, Lori. I'm familiar with Marshalltown, where her house was, and you said that she spent most of her time there. It just makes you realize that these are not images out her door. I mean, that's just a long little road, and there's really nothing to look at. You can't see anything. So it's all these images are coming from, it would seem, previous experience, or how don't you sit in there looking at them? Because I don't think she traveled very much, did she? Or
No, she would have traveled like in and around kind of Yarmouth and Digby, right? Like as a child growing up, and then, you know, in the early days, you know, with Everett kind of, you know, traveling around with him while he was fish peddling. But, you know, one of the things I kind of find interesting, right? If we're thinking about the language of like modern artists, right? Modern artists would often be celebrated like, oh, like this modern artist built a studio and like got away from it all and is painting in the woods, and like that's celebrated. But in Maud Lewis, it's like, well, she wasn't going anywhere. So what could she take inspiration from? And so I find that like the way we use language and description is quite interesting. But yeah, her radius was quite small. In Telescope series, she does talk about how, you know, she makes up a lot of her images, right? And you can see that, you know, there's not correspondence always of seasons, right? She's kind of painting what she feels like. Or in her train stations, they're not always accurate of like the area in which she's painting. Usually she's painting scenes, you know, from much earlier. So you definitely see that through her work. But yeah, I mean, where her house actually was like, I mean, it's remote now. And so one can imagine how remote like that road in Marshalltown would have been back in the day, except that it would have been the main corridor for the ferry, right? So it would have been a busy road of tourists and travelers coming back and forth, whereas now that road's kind of circumvented because there's a new road you can kind of get around on. Yes?
You say that you want to look at or examine her work as an artist rather than as just a folky tourist, somebody who's producing for the tourist economy. And I'm wondering, so when you think about her work as valuable work of an artist, what do you think are the things that she contributes the most to the art world? Like, what are the characteristics of the way she worked, or how she worked, or the way that Monet works with light, or Warhol was using techniques and printing? You know, what are her quintessential characteristics as an artist that make her work really important to study as art?
Man, it's a really good question.
He just wrote a book, so
I have to write another one just for that. So I mean, so I think there are a few things. I think one is her use of color. I think that when you look at many Maud Lewis works, there's a really interesting use of color. And so what I mean by that is her choice of color, the color that she puts next. So there's a painting in the book of Oakdean School. So Oakdean School is a school in Bear River, and she'll put like, you know, red next to orange or blue next to green. And so the way that she's making color choices, I think is quite interesting. And if we think about the language that we use to talk about artists, like I would say that that's one to kind of explore and kind of talk about. The other one I think is also her repetition, right, of imagery. Even if one can say, you know, her repetition of imagery is mainly kind of, you know, economic motivated, right, to kind of sell works, or, you know, as her physical capabilities declined, it also, you know, made it easier, right, to start repeating, you know, images. I think the repetition is interesting in its variances. So again, I think it doesn't work if you only look at one painting. You have to look at like a whole bunch, let's say, of her Model Ts, or a whole bunch of her oxen, and then you can kind of see those variances. I think the other thing, though, that I would say is the way in which, particularly, I argue in the book, her landscapes. So her landscapes are not, like they're recognizable enough that you can kind of say, okay, that's the area in Bear River, or like that's the harbor. So you can kind of generally know where they are, but ultimately they capture the energy and the essence of being there. So one of the things in a lot of her works are seagulls. And there's this quote that Everett kind of talked about is after her passing, he talks about how the seagulls kind of stopped coming around. And Maud Lewis always kind of loved birds so much. But one of the things that I think about with the seagulls in terms of capturing like essence of the landscape is that if anyone's been to a harbor in Nova Scotia, particularly when like a fishing boat is coming in, the seagulls are deafening, right? The sound of seagulls swirling in the sky, trying to kind of steal is kind of deafening. And so to me, the way she also captures the mood of a landscape is also something that I would say in terms of like as an artist that I think is really worth exploring and talking about, which I do in the book. Any other comments? Okay, I think we will wrap up. Thank you all for coming. I know Nimbus is set up outside, and I'm also happy to chat with any of you one-on-one, but also do please help spread the word, and if you have other questions, I love questions, so feel free to kind of message me or any of that. But thank you all for coming on a lovely Saturday, and I really appreciate seeing so many faces today, so thank you so much.